The night my daughter laughed at me, something inside my chest didn't break. It went still. People imagine betrayal as shouting, or tears, or slammed doors. They don't tell you about the kind that arrives disguised as humor. The kind that slips into a sentence, gets a laugh, and leaves you standing there wondering when respect quietly packed its bags and left your relationship without notice. I didn't raise my daughter to admire me. I raised her to be safe. To be confident. To never feel small. Somewhere along the way, she decided that meant I must have been weak. This is the story of the moment I realized love doesn't mean access forever. Of the door I didn't slam. The door I closed carefully, permanently. What happens when the person you sacrificed everything for decides you're beneath them? And what happens when a woman finally stops explaining her worth? Hi, I'm Angela. And this is my story. The restaurant had that polished kind of noise, the clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs, laughter that rose and fell like it had practiced doing so. I remember noticing it because it gave me something neutral to focus on. Something that wasn't my daughter sitting across from me, shoulders relaxed, confidence draped over her like a coat she'd learned to wear well. She looked beautiful that night. Effortlessly so. Hair pulled back in a way that suggested she hadn't tried too hard, which was part of the point. She spoke easily, laughed easily, belonged easily. I watched her the way mothers do when they're proud but careful not to show it too loudly. Pride, I'd learned, could embarrass grown children. Someone at the table asked what I did for work. I opened my mouth to answer. She didn't wait. Oh, my mom, she said, smiling. She's simple. She never really made it big or anything. But she's happy with her routines. She said it kindly. That's what made it worse. There was no edge in her voice. No cruelty. Just certainty. Like she was stating a fact everyone could already see. The table laughed softly, the way people do when they don't know if something is funny but don't want to make it awkward. I laughed too. Automatically. Years of practice made it effortless. Inside, something shifted, not sharply, not violently. It felt more like furniture being moved in a dark room. The same space, rearranged forever. Simple. Never made it big. Happy with her routines. Each phrase stacked neatly on top of the other, building a version of me I barely recognized but suddenly understood had been living in her mind for years. I wasn't her example of resilience. I wasn't her proof of strength. I was a baseline she'd stepped over. I thought about the mornings I woke before sunrise to make lunches. The evenings I worked late after my divorce because stability mattered more than rest. The promotions I declined because they required moving her schools again. The savings I drained so she wouldn't start adulthood in debt. None of that lived in her sentence. I nodded as if she described me accurately. Because correcting her would have required explaining myself, and something in me didn't want to do that anymore. The rest of dinner passed in fragments. I asked about her work. Her plans. Her next vacation. She answered generously, warmly, like someone indulging a harmless question. She didn't ask about me. When we stood outside later, the night air cool against my skin, she hugged me briefly. Don't overthink it, Mom, she said. You know I didn't mean anything. That was the moment it settled. You don't accidentally diminish someone you already respect. I drove home alone, the road familiar, my hands steady on the wheel. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I felt clear. Uncomfortably clear. For the first time, I understood that the distance between us hadn't appeared suddenly. It had simply stopped hiding. And once I saw how she truly measured me, I knew I could never stand in that place again. There's a version of my life my daughter knows, and another she never learned to see. The version she knows begins after things stabilized, after the chaos had been cleaned up, after the hard years were folded away like old clothes you don't need anymore. She grew up inside the quiet I built, not the noise I survived. She remembers packed lunches, not the budgeting spreadsheets. She remembers clean uniforms, not the nights I stayed awake calculating whether rent or groceries came first. She remembers a mother who showed up to school events on time, hair brushed, smile ready. She doesn't remember the mornings I cried in the car before work because crying at home felt irresponsible. I didn't hide those years on purpose. I just didn't narrate them. Mothers aren't taught to tell those stories. We're taught to absorb and adjust. To make stability look effortless so our children never feel the ground shaking beneath them. I worked jobs that never came with titles impressive enough to mention. I stayed because consistency mattered more than ambition. I chose proximity over prestige, hours that allowed dinner at home over positions that demanded everything. When my marriage ended, I learned quickly that survival isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. It's choosing the same hard thing every day without applause. She saw me pay bills. She never saw me skip meals. She saw me decline social invitations. She never knew it was because gas money mattered. She saw a woman who settled. She never recognized a woman who calculated every choice with a child's safety in mind. That night after the restaurant, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold. I let myself replay the years honestly, without minimizing them for anyone else's comfort. I remembered the shame I swallowed when asking for extensions. The quiet pride when I paid something off early. The loneliness of being strong because there was no alternative. I wondered when my resilience had started looking like mediocrity to her. Maybe it was inevitable. Children grow up and rewrite their parents' lives to fit their own narratives. Maybe it's easier to believe success is self-made when you don't see the scaffolding that held you upright. Still, the realization hurt in a specific way. She hadn't rejected my choices. She'd erased the reasons behind them. And in doing so, she'd erased me. I stood and washed the cup, dried it, placed it back in the cabinet. Small motions. Controlled motions. The kind that keep you from unraveling. I wasn't angry. Anger requires energy I didn't feel ready to spend. What I felt instead was a kind of grief I hadn't expected. Not grief for what I'd lost, but for what I'd never asked to be seen. I understood then that explaining myself wouldn't change her understanding. She didn't lack information. She lacked curiosity. And curiosity can't be demanded. As I turned off the kitchen light, one thought followed me down the hallway, quiet but insistent. If she didn't want to know who I really was, I needed to decide how much access she deserved to what I'd built. Once awareness settles in, memories reorganize themselves. Moments that once felt small suddenly line up, forming a pattern you can't ignore. That week, everything replayed differently. Her tone. Her pauses. The way she spoke to me like I was slightly behind the conversation instead of part of it. I noticed how often she corrected me in front of others. Not aggressively, just enough to establish hierarchy. I noticed how my opinions were tolerated but rarely acknowledged. How advice was accepted only if it matched conclusions she'd already reached. I thought back to a phone call months earlier. She'd been venting about work, pacing her apartment while I listened. At one point, she sighed and said, "I don't know how you managed on such little ambition. I could never live like that." I'd laughed then. I always laughed. Laughter smooths things over. Laughter keeps conversations moving. But now, replaying it, I heard something else. Disbelief. Distance. A quiet decision she'd already made about who I was. The moment that finally stripped away my doubt happened unintentionally. I was visiting for the weekend, staying in her guest room. I passed her bedroom door and heard my name through the crack, casual and unguarded. "She's not unhappy," my daughter said into her phone. "She just doesn't expect much from life. Some people are like that." I stopped walking. There was a pause, then her voice again, lighter. "Yeah. I think that's why I pushed myself so hard. I didn't want to end up the same." She laughed. Not cruelly. Confidently. I didn't interrupt. I didn't knock. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to a version of myself being summarized without my consent. When I finally moved, it was toward the bathroom. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the tub until the tightness in my chest loosened enough to breathe normally. That wasn't anger I felt. It was recognition. This wasn't about misunderstanding or generational difference. She wasn't confused about me. She was certain. And certainty is difficult to dismantle. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Same face I'd had for years. Lines earned honestly. Eyes tired but steady. I didn't see failure staring back at me. I saw endurance. But endurance doesn't translate well in a world that celebrates outcomes more than effort. And maybe that was the gap between us. She lived in a language of metrics. I lived in one of maintenance. That night, lying in the guest bed, I realized something quietly devastating. Respect hadn't left all at once. It had faded gradually, while I kept offering access as if nothing had changed. I'd been adjusting to preserve closeness while she'd been redefining the relationship entirely. And I had allowed it. I turned onto my side and stared at the wall, listening to the hum of the city outside her window. I wasn't planning anything yet. I wasn't ready for that. But I knew one thing for certain. I could not continue showing up in a role that no longer existed. The next morning, would hear a word that finally made everything unmistakably clear. We were folding laundry when it happened. A domestic task. Neutral ground. I'd always believed ordinary moments were the safest place for honesty, because they didn't feel like confrontations. Just shared time. Shared space. I handed her a stack of shirts, carefully folded the way she liked. She checked her phone between movements, efficient, distracted. You know, I said, keeping my voice even, sometimes the way you talk about my life, it hurts. She didn't look up. Mom, you're too sensitive, she said, like she was diagnosing a minor inconvenience. Sensitive. The word landed heavier than I expected. Not because it was new, but because of how easily it dismissed everything I just said. Pain reduced to a flaw. Reaction framed as weakness. I'm just being honest, she continued. I worked hard to build something different. I don't want to be dragged backward emotionally. Backward. There it was. The direction was clear in her mind. Upward was forward. And I was behind her. I waited for the moment when she might soften. When she might add something like, I didn't mean it that way, or I appreciate what you did. It didn't come. Instead, she sighed, folding another shirt. I don't think you realize how your mindset affected me growing up. I felt something inside me go very still. This wasn't an argument. Arguments imply negotiation. This was a declaration. I nodded. Slowly. Not in agreement, but in understanding. I saw then that she didn't want reconciliation. She wanted absolution. She wanted to move forward without carrying my feelings with her. And I couldn't give her that. That night, alone in my old bedroom at home, I cried quietly. Not from rage. From mourning. The kind that comes when you realize a relationship has already changed, and you're just catching up emotionally. I grieved the belief that love alone could preserve respect. I grieved the version of motherhood where sacrifice was remembered kindly. Most of all, I grieved the illusion that if I explained myself better, she'd see me differently. Explanations only work when someone is open to hearing them. She wasn't. When the tears stopped, I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling an unfamiliar calm settling over me. Calm can be unsettling when you're used to anxiety guiding your choices. I realized that night that something irreversible had shifted. Not between us, but within me. I no longer felt the urge to convince her of my worth. And without that urge, the relationship began to look very different. The next morning, I woke up knowing silence would change everything. After that conversation, I stopped trying to correct her version of me. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my choices. I didn't soften her words for her. I let silence do what explanations never had. At first, she didn't notice. Silence blends easily into routines when someone is used to being the center of emotional gravity. I still answered her calls. I still listened. But I stopped filling the gaps. I stopped offering solutions before she finished complaining. I stopped anticipating needs she hadn't yet voiced. The change was subtle, but it mattered. When she spoke about her work, I listened without validating every frustration. When she mentioned money, I didn't volunteer help. When she criticized something about her upbringing, I didn't rush to justify myself. I watched her reactions carefully. She mistook my restraint for guilt. I could see it in the way she spoke, more confidently dismissive, less cautious. Silence, to her, meant agreement. Or surrender. She leaned into it, assuming she'd won some unspoken debate. I noticed how often she still depended on me without acknowledging it. Advice. Emotional reassurance. Backup plans. The quiet safety net I'd always been. That realization changed something fundamental. She didn't need me as a person. She needed me as a function. The more I observed, the clearer it became. Affection followed convenience. Warmth followed compliance. When I didn't immediately respond, her tone shifted, impatience wrapped in concern. "You okay?" she'd ask, not because she was worried, but because my absence disrupted her expectations. I wasn't punishing her. I wasn't planning anything. I was simply paying attention for the first time without cushioning what I saw. And what I saw was this: my silence unsettled her more than my anger ever could have. One evening, after we ended a short phone call, I set my phone down and felt an unfamiliar sensation: relief. Not from conflict ending, but from not performing. From not adjusting myself to remain palatable. That was when I understood something painful but clarifying. She didn't miss me. She missed access. Access to reassurance. Access to unconditional support. Access to a mother who absorbed discomfort so she didn't have to. Once I recognized that distinction, I couldn't ignore it. Because love that depends on access isn't love, it's entitlement softened by history. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. And the next conversation would prove just how deeply she'd taken that access for granted. I didn't plan to tell anyone. That was never my style. I've always believed private things should stay contained, especially when they involve family. Complaining felt disloyal. Explaining felt pointless. But silence has weight, and after weeks of carrying it alone, I felt myself bending under something unnamed. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday, the kind that doesn't announce significance. Helen and I stayed back after work, lingering over coffee that had gone lukewarm without either of us noticing. She'd known me for years, through deadlines, restructures, quiet perseverance. She'd seen me steady when others unraveled. She asked, casually, "How's your daughter doing?" I opened my mouth with a rehearsed answer, then stopped. Something in my chest tightened, not sharply, but insistently. I stared into my cup longer than necessary. "I think she's ashamed of me," I said. The words felt unfamiliar out loud. Exposed. Dangerous. Helen didn't rush to contradict me. She didn't soften it with platitudes or insist I was imagining things. She just watched me carefully, as if she was deciding how much truth I could handle. "That happens," she said finally. "Especially when children succeed without understanding what made that success possible." I waited, my hands wrapped around the mug. "She's built a life she's proud of," Helen continued. "And she needs that pride to feel self-made. Acknowledging your sacrifice complicates that story." I felt something shift, not relief, but recognition. "She talks to me like I'm behind her," I admitted. "Like I didn't move forward fast enough." Helen leaned back slightly. "That's not honesty," she said. "That's hierarchy." The word startled me. Hierarchy. It explained so much. The tone. The dismissiveness. The way my feelings were framed as inconveniences instead of responses. Then Helen said the sentence that would follow me home and sit beside me long after the conversation ended. "You're not being respected because you never stopped rescuing." I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend myself. Instead, I felt something give way quietly inside me. She went on gently, "You taught her that minimizing you has no consequences. Because no matter how she speaks, you still show up the same way." I stared out the window at people passing by, each one carrying lives I'd never know. I realized how often I'd absorbed discomfort to keep peace. How often I'd adjusted my boundaries to remain useful. That wasn't love. It was habit. On the drive home, the rain streaked my windshield, blurring streetlights into soft halos. Helen's words repeated themselves, not accusing, not cruel. Clarifying. I wasn't being punished by my daughter. I was being used as something stable she no longer felt required to honor. That night, instead of distracting myself with television or chores, I opened a drawer I'd avoided for years. Inside were folders, documents, records, decisions postponed in the name of family harmony. I laid them out slowly, deliberately. And for the first time, I didn't feel emotional. I felt focused. Because once something is named truthfully, it demands to be answered. I didn't feel angry as I sat at the dining table that night. That surprised me. I'd expected anger to show up first, loud and demanding. Instead, what I felt was clarity. The kind that strips emotion down to its most functional form. I turned on a small lamp, not the overhead light, as if this work required restraint. I opened folders I hadn't touched in years. Not because I'd forgotten them, but because they represented decisions I'd postponed. Documents related to finances, emergency contacts, authorizations, accounts that had slowly accumulated layers of assumption over time. Things I'd set up when my daughter was younger, when protection and access felt interchangeable. I moved through them carefully. There were accounts she could see. Ones she could touch if she needed to. Plans that assumed I'd always be the safety net, the fallback, the quiet constant behind her independence. I saw how easily support had turned into expectation, and expectation into entitlement. I wasn't shocked. I was embarrassed. Not by her, but by myself. I had confused generosity with permanence. I'd never stopped to ask whether the access I'd granted was still appropriate, or whether it was being respected. I'd assumed love would regulate behavior on its own. It hadn't. I made a list on a yellow legal pad. I didn't title it. I didn't dramatize it. Just columns. What was necessary? What was optional? What was no longer healthy? Some things were obvious. Others required longer pauses. I forced myself to be honest, not kind. Kindness had gotten me here. Honesty needed to take the lead. I contacted professionals the next day. Quiet conversations. Clear questions. No accusations. No stories. Just facts and future planning. I listened more than I spoke. Took notes. Asked follow-ups. Each step felt strangely grounding. Not because I was taking something away, but because I was finally acknowledging what belonged to me to decide. I didn't tell my daughter. Not out of secrecy, but because I wasn't asking permission. Doors don't need to announce themselves when they're closing. They simply stop opening as easily. By midweek, everything that needed restructuring had been addressed. Access adjusted. Assumptions corrected. Safeguards restored where they belonged. I expected guilt to follow. It didn't. What I felt instead was a steady calm, like setting down a heavy bag you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not the shallow rest of exhaustion, but real sleep. When I woke, there was a message from my daughter. Short. Neutral. Asking about something small she assumed I'd handle. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. For years, I would have replied immediately. Smoothed things over. Fixed it. Maintained the rhythm. This time, I didn't rush. I set the phone down and finished my coffee. For the first time, I understood that boundaries don't announce themselves with speeches. They show up in changed behavior. In pauses where there used to be compliance. And that pause, I knew, would not go unnoticed. Because the moment access disappears, entitlement reveals itself very quickly. She called on a Sunday afternoon, which should have been my first clue. Sundays had always been reserved for convenience, times when she assumed I'd be available, relaxed, receptive. I watched the phone vibrate on the table for several seconds before answering, noticing how unfamiliar it felt not to rush. "Hey," she said, her voice lighter than it needed to be. "You've been kind of distant lately." I didn't deny it. I didn't explain. "I just wanted to check in," she continued. "If I said something that upset you, I'm sorry." The apology hovered there, unfinished. Conditional. It didn't name what she'd said or why it mattered. It was an offering designed to smooth the path forward, not revisit what had happened. I waited. There was a brief pause, then the real reason surfaced. "I need your help with something," she said. "It's not a big deal, but it would really make things easier." I listened as she explained. It was familiar territory. A problem she expected me to solve. A gap she assumed I'd fill. Her tone was confident, almost relieved, like the apology had already done its work. When she finished, I took a breath. "I can't do that," I said. Silence followed, not confusion, but disbelief. "What do you mean, you can't?" she asked, sharper now. "I mean no," I said calmly. "I'm not available." The words felt strange and solid in my mouth, like furniture that had always belonged in the room but had never been placed correctly before. There was a shift on the other end of the line. I could hear it. The recalculation. The irritation masked as concern. "Since when?" she asked. I didn't answer that. Because the truth, that it had always been this way, I just never admitted it, wasn't something she was ready to hear. She sighed. "You're overreacting," she said. I already apologized. I didn't argue. Arguments invite negotiation. I wasn't negotiating. We ended the call politely, but the air between us felt different. Thinner. Charged. Afterward, I sat quietly, letting the moment settle. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt steady. The kind of steadiness that comes from alignment, not dominance. I realized then that her apology hadn't been about repair. It had been a key, inserted quickly, expected to unlock access without resistance. When it didn't work, confusion followed. That wasn't remorse. That was strategy. I understood now why my silence had unsettled her. Silence disrupted patterns. It forced her to confront something she hadn't expected to lose, predictability. Later that evening, I received a message. Short. Frustrated. Carefully worded to sound reasonable. "You're really changing, Mom. I don't know what's going on with you." I read it once. Then again. She was right about one thing. I was changing. Not into someone colder. Not into someone cruel. Into someone who no longer mistook access for love. I set the phone face down and went about my evening, aware, deeply aware, that something irreversible had begun. Because when boundaries appear, the next reaction is never acceptance, it's resistance. She didn't discover the change through a conversation. That would have required listening. She discovered it the way people always do when they assume access is permanent, through systems that no longer responded the way they used to. The first sign was small. A delay. Something she expected to move smoothly didn't. She called me, irritation already threaded through her voice, not yet alarmed. "I think something's wrong," she said. "I can't access what I need." I listened without interrupting. Let her explain. Let her circle the issue the way she always did, assuming it would resolve itself once I stepped in. When she finished, I said carefully, "Nothing's wrong." She paused. Then why isn't it working? Because things are different now, I replied. The silence that followed was heavier than the one after my refusal the week before. This one carried confusion. Then suspicion. What do you mean, different? She asked. I chose my words slowly. Not because I was afraid, but because precision mattered. I mean, I reviewed my arrangements, I said. And I changed them. Her breath hitched. Not dramatically. Just enough to hear. You didn't tell me, she said. I didn't need to. That was when her tone shifted completely. The confidence drained out of it, replaced by something rawer. Why would you do that? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify myself. Because I finally listened to how you see me. She started to argue, then stopped. Words rearranged themselves on the other end of the line, searching for leverage that wasn't there. This feels extreme, she said. You're acting like I did something unforgivable. I'm not punishing you, I said. I'm adjusting. For what? She demanded. For reality. That was when it landed. Not emotionally, logically. She understood then that this wasn't about a disagreement. This wasn't a mood or a phase. Something structural had changed. Something that didn't bend back with apologies or pressure. You're my mother, she said finally. You can't just shut me out. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. I'm not shutting you out, I said. I'm stepping back. There was a tremor in her voice now. Not fear, loss of control. You're overreacting to one comment. It wasn't one comment, I said. It was a pattern. She went quiet. I could hear her breathing, uneven now. For the first time, she didn't know which version of me she was speaking to. The compliant one she'd grown used to, or this steadier, unfamiliar presence. When did you decide this? She asked. I thought about it. About the coffee with Helen. The folder on my table. The pause before answering her call. I didn't decide it all at once, I said. I just stopped ignoring it. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She did something worse. She tried to reason her way back into position. We're family, she said. This isn't how family works. I almost smiled. Family, apparently, was supposed to absorb disrespect quietly. This is how it works now, I said. The call ended without resolution. No agreement. No apology. Just distance stretching into something solid. I sat there afterward, phone in my hand, heart steady. I felt grief, yes, but not doubt. Because she finally understood something crucial. The door hadn't slammed. It had closed carefully, deliberately, and it wasn't reopening. And once control disappears, the next thing that surfaces is desperation. The shift didn't happen all at once. Control rarely disappears dramatically. It erodes, piece by piece, until the person who relied on it realizes too late that it's gone. With my daughter, I saw the stages clearly once I stopped absorbing them for her. First came logic. She called again 2 days later, her voice measured, professional, as if reason alone would reset everything. I've been thinking, she said. This doesn't make sense financially. It's inefficient. You're creating problems that don't need to exist. I listened without interrupting. She explained, calmly at first, how things had always worked, how they were supposed to work. She spoke as if continuity were a law, not a habit. As if the past automatically justified the future. When she finished, I said, I understand what you're saying. Relief flickered briefly in her voice. Good. Then. But my answer is still no, I added. The relief vanished. Next came guilt. I thought you wanted the best for me, she said. I thought you believed in supporting family. I recognized this tactic immediately. It was familiar. I'd used it on myself for years. Framing sacrifice as morality. Obligation as love. I do want the best for you, I replied. That doesn't require access to everything in my life. She inhaled sharply. You're acting like I'm some kind of burden. I didn't say that. But you're treating me like one. I let that sit between us. Because correcting her would have meant defending myself again. And I was done defending. Then came anger. You're being unfair, she snapped. You're punishing me for being honest. I'm not punishing you, I said. I'm responding. To what? She demanded. To how I'm treated. Her voice rose, not into shouting, but into sharpness. The edge she used when she expected resistance to fold. You don't get to rewrite the rules just because your feelings are hurt. That was the moment I understood something fully. She didn't believe I had authority. Only availability. Authority unsettles people who are used to access without consequence. I'm not rewriting rules, I said evenly. I'm choosing boundaries. She scoffed. You'll regret this. Maybe I would have, once. When my sense of worth depended on her approval. But standing there, phone pressed to my ear, I felt something unexpected. Stillness. She kept talking, words tumbling over each other now, arguments overlapping, desperation beginning to bleed through the structure of her logic. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. I let the unraveling happen without trying to stop it. When she finally paused, waiting for my response, I said, I need to go. What? She said. I'm done with this conversation, I added calmly. We can talk another time. I ended the call before she could respond. My hands weren't shaking. My chest wasn't tight. I stood by the window for a moment, watching cars move steadily down the street, each one going somewhere without needing permission. For the first time, I saw it clearly. Her anger wasn't about loss. It was about power. And power, once reclaimed, does not negotiate itself back into surrender. What followed wasn't confrontation, it was absence, and that frightened her more than any argument ever could. People think the hardest part of drawing boundaries is the moment you set them. They imagine raised voices, slammed doors, dramatic fallout. What they don't talk about is what comes after. The quiet. The space where noise used to be. The way absence settles into daily life like a new piece of furniture you keep bumping into. After that last call, my daughter went silent. Not immediately. At first, there were brief messages. Neutral updates. Questions phrased carefully, as if politeness might reopen doors force hadn't. I responded briefly, kindly, without explanation. I didn't withdraw completely. I just stopped overextending. Then the messages stopped too. Days passed. Then weeks. I found myself reaching for my phone out of habit, not urgency. The reflex to check on her, to offer something, advice, reassurance, solutions, was still there, but quieter. Like muscle memory slowly fading. The grief surprised me. Not because I missed conflict, but because I missed the version of her I thought I'd raised. The one who believed connection didn't require hierarchy. The one who didn't measure love by usefulness. I mourned that loss privately. I didn't announce it. I didn't share it online or dissect it with acquaintances. Some grief deserves dignity. Life, however, continued. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I paid bills. I walked in the evenings, noticing details I'd rushed past before, the way the air cooled after sunset, the rhythm of my own footsteps. There was a strange steadiness in those routines now. They belonged entirely to me. I noticed something else too. I wasn't anxious. There was no constant background tension, no waiting for the next request, the next emotional negotiation. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head or anticipating needs before they were voiced. That silence my daughter left behind didn't echo the way I expected it to. It softened. Occasionally, guilt surfaced. It always does. Guilt is persistent when you've been trained to equate self-denial with love. But when it came, I didn't panic. I sat with it. Asked where it came from. Whether it was earned or inherited. Most of the time, it faded. One evening, a friend asked casually, "How's your daughter?" I answered honestly. "We're giving each other space." The words felt balanced. Not defensive. Not bitter. I realized then that I hadn't lost myself in this process. I'd found myself again, quietly, without ceremony. The woman who existed before motherhood consumed every margin of her identity. I still loved my daughter. That hadn't changed. But love no longer meant surrender. That distinction mattered more than anything else I'd learned in years. As I turned off the lights that night, I understood something essential. This wasn't punishment. This was recalibration. And recalibration doesn't announce itself. It simply changes how things move going forward. What I didn't yet realize was how much my absence was forcing her to confront herself. Once the noise quieted, I noticed how much of my life had been spent proving things no one had formally asked me to prove. That I was good enough. Capable enough. Worth keeping around. Motherhood had amplified that instinct until it felt like obligation rather than choice. Without my daughter's constant presence, that urge loosened. I stopped explaining myself. Not just to her, but to everyone. If I declined an invitation, I declined it. No justification. If I made a decision, I trusted it. I didn't preemptively soften my choices in case they disappointed someone else. It was unsettling at first. Freedom often is when you've mistaken compliance for connection. I rearranged my evenings. Took classes I'd postponed for years. Not to improve myself, not to impress anyone, but because I wanted to. I redecorated my living space slowly, deliberately, choosing things that felt like me rather than neutral. I noticed how often women my age apologize for existing loudly. For wanting more time. More quiet. More room. I stopped doing that too. Sometimes, I wondered what my daughter would think if she saw this version of me. Not successful in the way she valued, but settled. Rooted. Unbothered by comparison. The thought didn't sting the way it once would have. Because I wasn't living for her evaluation anymore. Weeks later, she reached out briefly. A short message. Polite. Guarded. "Hope you're well." I replied in kind. No invitation. No probing. No reopening. I wasn't closing her out. I was allowing the relationship to exist only at the level it could sustain without erasing me. That boundary felt clean. One afternoon, sitting alone with a cup of coffee, I realized something quietly profound. I liked my life. Not as compensation. Not as distraction. As reality. I liked waking up without emotional negotiations waiting for me. I liked knowing my decisions wouldn't be overridden by guilt. I liked being responsible only for myself again. Motherhood doesn't end when children grow up, but martyrdom should. That was the lesson I was learning late, but honestly. And honesty, even delayed, still counts. As the evening settled, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace that didn't depend on anyone else's behavior. It was then I finally understood what she had meant by failure, and why she was wrong. The word stayed with me longer than I expected. Failure. She hadn't said it directly that night at the restaurant, but she didn't need to. It lived in the space between her sentences. In the way she described my life as something small. Manageable. Unambitious. I thought about it often, not with anger, but curiosity. What does failure actually look like? Is it a life without prestige? Without visible milestones? Without stories impressive enough to share casually over dinner? Or is failure something quieter? I looked back over my years honestly. The decisions I'd made. The compromises I'd chosen. The sacrifices I'd offered without applause. I asked myself questions I'd never asked before, not because they were forbidden, but because I'd been too busy surviving to interrogate meaning. Had I failed? I'd kept a child safe through instability. I'd built consistency out of scarcity. I'd adapted, endured, adjusted. If that was failure, it was one I could live with. I realized then that my daughter and I were using different measurements entirely. She measured life vertically, upward motion, visible success, distance from origins. I measured it horizontally, sustainability, continuity, emotional solvency. Neither was wrong. But only one required diminishing someone else to validate itself. That was the difference. She needed me to be lesser so she could feel greater. I no longer needed that equation. Understanding this didn't harden me. It softened something tight inside. I could see her now not as cruel, but as limited by her own framework. Trapped by the belief that value must be proven constantly. I was free of that belief. That freedom didn't make me superior. It made me finished with comparison. One evening, I wrote a letter I never sent. Not to accuse her, but to release myself. I acknowledged the hurt. The love. The boundary. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer. Some things don't need witnesses. As I closed the drawer, I felt the final piece settle into place. I wasn't a failure who'd raised a successful daughter. I was a woman who'd succeeded quietly, and raised someone who hadn't yet learned what that meant. That wasn't my burden anymore. The final test would be whether I could hold that truth without reopening the door out of habit. The last moment came without drama. No confrontation. No speech. Just a choice presented gently, almost kindly. She called months later, her voice careful, her tone softened by time. She spoke about logistics, about reconnecting, about moving forward. There was no apology, just implication. The assumption that enough time had passed for things to return to normal. Normal. I listened quietly, letting her finish. Then I said, "I'm glad you're doing well." She waited. "I'm not reopening things the way they were," I continued. "That chapter is closed." The pause on the line stretched longer than any silence we'd shared before. "You're really serious," she said finally. "Yes," I replied. Calm. Certain. There was disappointment there. Confusion. A hint of loss. But there was also something else. Recognition. She understood then that this wasn't anger waiting to cool. It was a door closed with intention. We ended the call politely. Afterward, I stood in my living room, sunlight filtering through the windows, dust floating lazily in the air. Everything felt ordinary, and that was the point. I hadn't won anything. I'd reclaimed something. My time. My authority. My sense of self. Motherhood had taught me how to give. This chapter taught me how to stop giving without disappearing. I sat down, breathing evenly, and felt no urge to second-guess myself. No guilt demanding explanation. No fear of being misunderstood. Some people will never understand your boundaries because they benefited from your lack of them. That's not your failure. That's your clarity. As evening settled in, I felt peaceful. Not triumphant. Not hardened. Simply at rest with myself. The door remained closed. Not out of spite. Out of self-respect. And for the first time in a long while, I knew exactly who I was, without needing anyone else to agree.